The bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolled midnight with a solemn gravity that seemed to press upon the very stones of Rome. Within the Apostolic Palace, behind walls that had witnessed centuries of secrets, a crime had been committed so quietly that the first hint of its existence was not a scream nor a struggle but silence. Monsignor Paolo Ricci had been a meticulous man. His office, situated along a narrow corridor overlooking the Cortile del Belvedere, reflected this precision. Shelves aligned perfectly, papers squared. The silver crucifix on his desk polished to a mirror sheen. Yet it was there, at precisely 6 minutes past midnight, that he was found seated upright in his chair, hands folded as if in prayer, his head inclined slightly to the right. He was dead. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. The windows were latched from within, the heavy oak door locked, the key resting in the inside keyhole. A single lamp burned steadily on the desk, illuminating an open folio of Latin correspondence, and beside his right hand lay an object so absurd, so inexplicable, that it rendered the scene almost theatrical. A small crimson carnival mask. It was the kind sold in tourist stalls along the Tiber-lacquered red, trimmed with cheap gold braid, with a thin elastic string attached, entirely out of place amid parchment seals and ecclesiastical wax. The Swiss guards stationed outside the corridor swore no one had passed. The night clerk confirmed Monsignor Ricci had dismissed his secretary early and intended to work alone. No poison was immediately evident, no wound marred his body. The Vatican physician, summoned within minutes, declared the cause of death uncertain but sudden. The expression upon the Monsignor's face was neither agony nor peace, it was surprise. By dawn, the inner circles of the Curia murmured with unease. Ricci had been overseeing a confidential review of certain financial archives records sensitive enough to stir discomfort in powerful quarters. Yet no documents were missing, no drawers disturbed. The folio before him concerned a mundane exchange with a diocese in Umbria. Too simple suggested one cardinal. Too perfect whispered another. By 9 o'clock, the matter had quietly extended beyond Vatican walls, for discreetly, a private inquiry was requested. The name proposed carried its own weight of legend and irritation. Hercule Poirot arrived shortly before noon, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marbled floor as though he walked not into a crime scene but into a salon. His eyes, bright and precise, took in the guarded faces, the anxious glances, the oppressive hush. "Mes amis," he said gently, adjusting his cuffs. When a man dies alone in a locked room, it is rarely God who has turned the key. He was led into the Monsignor's office. Poirot paused just inside the threshold, inhaling faint traces of incense and ink. He did not immediately approach the body. Instead, he observed the geometry of the room, the symmetry of the shelves, the straightness of the rug, the measured distance between desk and window. Then his gaze settled upon the mask. He did not touch it. "A curious companion," he murmured. "Tell me if Monsignor Ricci possess a sense of humor?" The attending priest frowned. "None that involved that." Poirot leaned closer. The mask bore no fingerprints discernible to the naked eye. Its elastic was unstretched, pristine. It had been placed, not dropped. "Ah," Poirot whispered, almost to himself. "So it is not random. It is a message. But to whom?" He examined the key in the door. Undisturbed, the windows secure, no hidden panels, the fireplace sealed. The room was, in every respect, hermetically closed. Yet a man had died. Poirot's eyes drifted to the Monsignor's folded hands, too neat, too deliberate, as though arranged after the factor by the victim himself in a final act of ritual. Outside, the bells began to toll once more, echoing through the Vatican courtyards. A locked room, a silent death, a carnival mask in the heart of Christendom. It was either the simplest crime in the world or the most impossible. Poirot remained very still, his gaze resting upon the folded hands of Monsignor Ricci long after the others in the room had grown uncomfortable with the silence. At last, he spoke without turning his head. "Who discovered the body?" "A junior archivist," replied the attending priest, Brother Matteo. "He came to deliver a document early this morning." "Ah!" "And he touched nothing, so he claims." Poirot nodded faintly. "We shall speak with him. But first, let us consider what is not here." The remark puzzled the men surrounding him, but Poirot moved now, gliding toward the desk with delicate precision. He leaned close to the folio of Latin correspondence, reading a line or two. Then he turned a single page back. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. The priest stepped closer. "You see something. I see absence. It is often more eloquent than presence." He tapped the folio lightly. "You say nothing is missing. Yet this letter, observe, has been opened, read, and returned. But the wax seal upon the envelope in the wastebasket has been broken recently. The paper, however, was written weeks ago." The priest frowned. "That is not unusual." "No," Poirot agreed. "But the Monsignor was a man of order. Would he break a seal and then throw away the envelope while working at midnight? It is untidy. It is unlike him." His eyes moved across the desk once more, then stopped. The lamp. He adjusted it slightly and smiled to himself. "Who lit this?" The priest hesitated. "It was burning when the body was found." "Of course. But who lit it, we do not know." Poirot crouched, examining the base. A faint smudge of wax clung near the switch. Not candle wax sealing wax. "Curious," he said softly. He rose again and turned toward the door. "May I see the corridor?" The Swiss guard outside stiffened as Poirot emerged. The corridor stretched in both directions, polished marble reflecting the daylight streaming through distant windows. It was empty, serene, almost sacred. "Tell me," Poirot said to the guard, "you remained here all night?" "Yes, monsieur." No one entered. No one at all. Except His Eminence Cardinal Bianchi shortly after 11. He spoke briefly with Monsignor Rixi and departed. The attending priest started. That was not reported. The guard flushed. It seemed unimportant. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Nothing is unimportant, my friend, especially what one chooses not to say." He paced slowly along the corridor, then stopped beside a narrow table against the wall. Upon it stood a porcelain vase filled with fresh white lilies. He leaned closer. One of these was moved. The priest stared. "Moved?" "Yes, see the waterline. One stem has been removed and replaced recently. But why would that matter?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he looked back toward the office door, then toward the distant window at the end of the corridor. The angle. The distance. The timing. "Brother Matteo," he said suddenly. "Bring him to me." The young archivist arrived moments later, pale and trembling. He wrung his hands as though trying to wash them of guilt that had not yet been named. "You discovered the body?" Poirot said gently. "Yes, monsieur." "I knocked. There was no answer. The door was locked, but the key he swallowed." "I saw it. I called for help." "You noticed nothing unusual?" The young man hesitated. Poirot smiled kindly. "Courage. The truth is a friend." "There was a smell," Brother Matteo whispered. "Not strong. Sweet. Like almonds." A murmur passed among the clergy. Poirot's eyes flashed. "And you told no one?" "I thought I imagined it." "Perhaps," Poirot said softly. "Or perhaps you did not." He studied the young man a moment longer, then dismissed him with a nod. The priest leaned closer. "Poison?" "Perhaps," Poirot replied. "But poison alone does not lock doors, place masks, or rearrange flowers." His gaze returned once more to the office. "The cardinal," he said thoughtfully. "He visits late at night, yet this was not considered important." The envelope is opened again. The lamp bears wax. A flower is disturbed, and a scent faint delicately lingers in the memory of a frightened boy. He folded his hands, mirroring the posture of the dead man. "Already, my friend, we see the first little lies, but they are like threads. If one pulls gently, the whole tapestry may unravel." Poirot returned to the office, his small frame moving with deliberate precision as the priests and aides gathered uneasily around him. He motioned for the first witness, Cardinal Biancato, to approach. The cardinal's expression was calm, almost rehearsed, yet Poirot's eyes, sharp as ever, betrayed the slightest twitch of uncertainty at the corner of his mouth. "Cardinal," Poirot began softly, "you spoke with Monsignor Ricci last night?" "Yes," the cardinal replied, his voice steady. It was brief. "I inquired about a report. He gave me his opinion, and I departed. Nothing more." Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping the room, noting the way the cardinal's hands were folded, just a little too rigidly. "At what time did you arrive?" "Shortly after 11. I left within 10 minutes." "And the door?" "Closed, of course." He assured me all was in order. Poirot's lips pressed together. "I see. And did you notice anything unusual? A smell, a movement, a misplaced object?" The cardinal's eyes flicked to the floor. "Nothing at all, I assure you." Poirot's small moustache twitched. "Ah, yes. Nothing is often very revealing." He left the words hanging like a delicate bell in the room. Next came Brother Matteo. The young archivist's hands trembled as he recounted the night again, but Poirot noticed subtle discrepancies compared to the first account. The time of his knock now shifted slightly. He remembered opening the corridor door only after a pause, rather than immediately. Poirot's gaze lingered on the faint stains of wax on his sleeve. "Brother Matteo," Poirot asked gently, "you smelled almonds last night?" "Yes, monsieur," the boy admitted, lowering his eyes. "It was faint but unmistakable." "And you did not tell anyone?" "Too thought perhaps it was my imagination." "I feared," his voice faltered, the fear of punishment barely masked. Poirot made no reply, merely made a note of the hesitation, the pause before the truth emerged. The secretary, Signorina Livia Conti, followed. She appeared eager, too eager to cooperate, recounting every minute detail with the precision of someone rehearsing. "I left before 6. Monsignor was still in his office reading correspondence. Nothing unusual," she said, smiling in a way that suggested she wanted Poirot to believe in her thoroughness. Yet Poirot's eyes caught her glancing repeatedly at a corner of the room, toward the vase of lilies and the discarded envelope. A small deception, perhaps unintentional, but revealing. "Signorina," Poirot asked, "you never checked the wastebasket?" "No, monsieur," she replied quickly. "That is not my duty. I would never disturb Monsignor's papers." Poirot's small finger tapped the edge of the desk. "But you have been here before. Surely you noticed this envelope among others in the bin?" She hesitated, caught between truth and propriety. "To suppose I saw it once, yes, but I did not touch it." He smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with subtle triumph. "A very important observation, my dear. Often what one pretends not to see is as meaningful as what one claims to notice." Finally, the Monsignor's assistant, Father Luciani, was called. He appeared stoic, composed, yet Poirot's careful inspection revealed a twitch in his left eye each time he mentioned Cardinal Bianchi. His account conflicted slightly with the others regarding the exact hour of the cardinal's visit. He claimed to have been in the next corridor, arranging files. Yet Poirot caught a faint smear of red dust on the cuff of his sleeve, matching the trim of the crimson mask. The detective's mind worked quietly, piecing together tiny contradictions. Each witness, each account, was a delicate thread woven into a tapestry of hidden motives. Some words were too polished, some silences too revealing. The young archivist's fear, the secretary's over-eagerness, the cardinal's almost perfect calm. Father Luciani's subtle, nervous gesture, all these details danced in Poirot's mind. "Yes, my friends," he murmured to himself, pacing slowly. "All is orderly, all is controlled, and yet nothing is as it seems. Each truth contains a shadow of falsehood, and every shadow whispers a secret." The room seemed to lean in closer, as if the very walls were listening. Poirot's eyes rested on the crimson mask, lying innocuously on the desk, and for the first time a faint, satisfied smile curved his lips. The deception was not yet fully revealed, but the voices of it had begun to speak, and Hercule Poirot, with his small grey cells alert, was listening. Poirot spent the late afternoon in quiet contemplation, seated on a carved wooden chair in a shadowed corner of the office. The sunlight that filtered through the tall windows fell in slender beams across the desk, illuminating the crimson mask as though it were a signal rather than a trinket. He folded his hands, steepling his fingers, and allowed his mind to wander through the labyrinth of motives that the morning's testimonies had revealed. First, Cardinal Bianchi. The man's calm and measured manner masked something deeper. Poirot considered the subtle twitch at the corner of the cardinal's mouth when asked about the envelope. Ritchie had been reviewing sensitive financial records, and the cardinal had a known interest in the redistribution of church funds. Greed? Perhaps. Influence? Very likely. But the cardinal's carefully cultivated reputation would not allow a slip of the tongue if he were involved. It would have been indirect, cunningly orchestrated, and almost invisible. Then there was Father Luciani, ostensibly the most loyal assistant. Yet Poirot remembered the red dust on his cuff, the same crimson as the mask. He had been in the corridor when the cardinal visited, supposedly arranging files. But why would he handle the mask, and why would a man so devoted show a twitch at a question about the cardinal? Perhaps jealousy, or the fear of exposure for some hidden complicity, perhaps even revenge, subtle and patient, directed toward Monsignor Ricci for some old grievance buried beneath outward devotion. Signorina Livia Conti, the secretary, offered another thread. Her eagerness to recount every detail with precision struck Poirot as slightly performative. She had clearly been observing Ricci closely, perhaps too closely. A misplaced document, a broken seal, a secret letter all could serve as leverage. Ambition could drive one to disturb the order of the night, a petty but dangerous meddling, all while preserving the illusion of innocence. And yet, no fingerprints on the mask. She had opportunity but perhaps lacked the nerve. Brother Matteo remained the most vulnerable piece. His trembling confession about the faint scent of almonds, a classic warning of cyanide, was revealing. Poison, subtle and silent, required calculation and courage. Yet, a frightened boy would hardly wield it. Poirot did not discount him entirely, but the evidence suggested he had been more a witness than an agent, caught between truth and fear. Poirot rose and began pacing slowly, the floor cold beneath his polished shoes. Each suspect was a node in a web, each motive a different strand, and each strand seemed to intersect in ways both predictable and confounding. The cardinal for power, Luciani for loyalty turned resentment, the secretary for ambition, the boy for innocence, yet one act had brought them together, and one object, the crimson mask, stood at the center. The detective considered the placement of the mask on the desk, the disturbed flower in the vase, and the wax smear on the lamp. None of these were trivial. Each was a signpost, a message, or perhaps a misdirection. The Monsignor's office had been a stage, and every actor had performed their role, some knowingly, some unconsciously. He drew a careful breath. "Ah, mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. "Each motive is plausible. Each opportunity exists. And yet, the perfect crime requires alignment, like the notes of a symphony. But one false note, one overlooked gesture, and the melody unravels." He walked to the window, looking down at the quiet courtyards of the Vatican. Somewhere below, a path of secrecy and deception wound through polished corridors and hidden rooms. A motive alone would not suffice. Timing, opportunity, psychology, and the delicate art of manipulation were all intertwined. Poirot returned to the desk, crouched briefly to examine the mask, then stood. His eyes, small but piercing, rested on the open folio and the broken seal in the wastebasket. "Soon, my little grey cells," he whispered, "we shall see which thread, pulled ever so gently, unravels the whole web. For now, the maze of motives is tangled, but not forever." The day waned, shadows deepened, and the office seemed to pulse with secrets unspoken. Poirot's mind, as always, was already several steps ahead, anticipating the next revelation that would transform suspicion into certainty. Late that afternoon, a flurry of activity filled the Vatican corridors. The Swiss guards scurried between offices, messengers ran with hastily scribbled notes, and murmurs of a solved mystery began to circulate among the clerical staff. Poirot had been summoned by the higher authorities to the prefecture, where the investigation had already gained traction. The breakthrough, they claimed, was simple. Father Luciani's cuff had borne traces of red dust, matching the crimson mask. His alibi was thin, and a small vial of cyanide supposedly misplaced in a storage closet had been found, its label faint but legible. The cardinal himself had suggested pressing charges, confident that the puzzle was complete. Luciani, pale and confused, was taken aside for questioning under the assumption that the case was closed. Poirot, however, remained seated in the prefecture's quiet chamber, his fingers lightly drumming on the polished surface of the table. He observed the officers bustling with self-satisfaction, each certain that justice had been served. And yet, his small grey cells were uneasy. Something about the narrative, neat as it appeared, did not harmonize with the facts he had carefully collected. The sea replayed itself in his mind. The wax smear on the lamp, the displaced flower, the open folio, the untouched envelope in the wastebasket, all these details formed a pattern that no single suspect, including Luciani, could account for. The red dust, while incriminating at first glance, was too convenient. too perfectly placed to be conclusive. Someone, Poirot realized, had orchestrated this moment, a setup to mislead and manipulate. He rose, his cane tapping lightly against the floor, and returned to the Monsignor's office. The mask lay innocuously on the desk, its red lacquer gleaming in the fading light. Poirot's gaze swept across the room once more, cataloguing each object, each imperfection. The seal on the discarded envelope had been broken deliberately, but the contents had been returned. The lamp bore wax not from recent burning but from some earlier calculated act. Every clue that appeared definitive had been designed to suggest a neat solution while concealing the true mechanism of the crime. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, "the criminal is clever. Too clever by half." The detective moved to the window, peering down at the quiet courtyards below. Whoever had manipulated events had observed the movements of the prefecture, had anticipated the rush to judgment. They were patient, meticulous, and still very much at large. A faint sound drew his attention, the soft shuffle of someone entering the office behind him. He turned, eyes narrowing slightly, but it was only Brother Matteo, clutching his notebook with notes from the morning's questioning. His innocence remained intact, yet the boy's fear lingered like a shadow. Poirot crouched to his level, speaking gently. "You did well, my friend. You observed. You remembered. Do not be afraid to speak the truth, no matter how insignificant it may seem. Often, it is the small, overlooked details that reveal the real culprit." The boy nodded, eyes wide, as though understanding that the danger was not over. Poirot straightened, glancing once more at the crimson mask. He smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. The authorities would celebrate a resolution, but the detective knew better. The threads he had begun to pull, the scent of almonds, the careful placement of objects, the subtle contradictions among witnesses pointed to someone still maneuvering behind the scenes. "Patience, patience," he murmured. "The criminal waits. The stage is set. And soon, when the moment is right, the final act will reveal itself." Outside, the evening sun dipped behind the Vatican spires, casting long shadows over stone courtyards. Inside, Hercule Poirot's mind raced ahead, anticipating the true game being played, aware that a false victory had been declared, but that the true architect of the crime had not yet revealed a single card. The masquerade was far from over, and the detective's small grey cells were already at work, ready to uncover the final hidden truth. Poirot spent the early evening in the quiet of the library adjoining the prefecture, surrounded by towering shelves of vellum-bound volumes. The day's revelations and the rushed conclusions of the authorities weighed upon him, but he felt a spark of opportunity. Sometimes the past, quiet and forgotten, held the key to the present. He had already begun to suspect that this crime was not a simple matter of ambition or greed, was a shadow stretching backward through time, entwining those present in a history that no one had thought to consider. He opened a ledger Monsignor Ricci had been studying weeks ago, reviewing past correspondences, donations, and personnel transfers. As he scanned the pages, a subtle pattern emerged: connections between Ricci, Father Luciani, and the Cardinal that had gone unnoticed. A decade earlier, a misappropriation of funds had nearly come to light, a scandal quietly suppressed. Ricci had uncovered irregularities, Luciani had been implicated indirectly, and Cardinal Bianchi had been the arbiter who ensured the matter remained confidential. A tangled web of loyalty, secrecy, and unspoken resentment stretched from that time to the present. Poirot paused over a memorandum dated years ago in which Luciani had recommended a particular junior assistant, Brother Matteo, for a clerical position. The young man's family had long served the church, and this recommendation had placed him squarely in Monsignor Ricci's office. Nothing suspicious in itself, yet Poirot noted the subtle language of obligation and indebtedness threaded through the memorandum. Matteo had been drawn into Ricci's orbit not merely by chance, but by ties that the others had taken for granted, ties that could be leveraged by someone patient and calculating. The detective's eyes moved to another detail, a photograph tucked into a file, yellowed with age, depicting Ricci, Luciani, and the Cardinal at a seminar years before, their expressions formal but guarded. Poirot observed the way Luciani's hand barely touched the Cardinal's arm, a gesture too stiff, too precise. A subtle tension, perhaps overlooked at the time, now suggested the lingering memory of betrayal or unacknowledged grievance. Every piece began to align. The mask, the envelope, the disturbed flower, they were not just random elements, but echoes of old events reshaped into a modern tableau of intimidation and misdirection. Someone had orchestrated this crime not merely to punish or eliminate, but to remind the others that the past was never truly buried. A debt remained unpaid, a slight unresolved. Poirot leaned back, allowing the pieces to settle in his mind. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured. "The past is a patient predator. It waits for the careless, the proud, or the ambitious to stumble, and then it strikes in silence." He reviewed the testimony once more, now with this historical lens. The cardinal's measured calm no longer seemed purely political. It was defensive, shielding secrets that had festered for years. Luciani's subtle twitch, the red dust, the careful placement of the mask all now had context, as a ritual of symbolic power, a way to communicate something unspoken but deeply understood. And the young brother Matteo, innocent yet positioned in the heart of this network, was both witness and unwitting instrument, his fear a reflection of history repeating itself. Poirot rose and returned to the Monsignor's office. He surveyed the room, noting each detail with renewed understanding. The wax on the lamp, the envelope, the mask, the flowers became pieces in a carefully rehearsed story, a narrative that linked past and present, that reminded the powerful of debts long owed. "Everything is connected," he whispered, his fingers brushing the mask. "The crime of tonight is not merely a momentary act of violence or ambition, it is a message carved from history, a shadow cast long before these walls were prepared to witness it." Outside, twilight deepened, and the quiet corridors of the Vatican seemed alive with unspoken memories. Poirot, small and deliberate, walked through them, his mind tracing paths backward through time as deftly as he would through the tangled threads of motive, opportunity, and deceit. Somewhere in these shadows of the past, the final truth awaited, patiently concealed and waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed. Poirot returned to the Monsignor's office just as the evening candles were being lit, their flickering flames casting long, quivering shadows across the polished desk. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if revisiting a familiar stage where each prop had its part to play. The mask lay in its place, the envelope undisturbed in the wastebasket, the flowers untouched since the morning. Everything suggested normalcy, yet Poirot knew better. He called for Father Luciani, insisting that the meeting be informal. "We shall sit together, quietly," he explained. "No officers, no questions, just conversation. Sometimes a human being will reveal what a formal inquiry cannot draw forth." Luciani appeared, hesitant, bowing with the careful grace of a man accustomed to control. His eyes flicked toward the mask, then away, almost imperceptibly. Poirot gestured toward a chair. "Sit, my friend. We shall speak of Monsieur Ricci, but not as investigators, as colleagues remembering someone we both admired." He seated himself, folding his hands calmly. "I find that when one is comfortable, when the mind is at ease, the smallest truths emerge naturally." Luciani shifted in his seat, stiffly at first. Poirot's voice, soft and coaxing, guided him toward recollection rather than interrogation. "Tell me, Father, how did you perceive Monsignor Ricci? What sort of man was he in your personal experience?" Luciani spoke cautiously, offering polite compliments, recounting Ricci's devotion to duty and his meticulous habits. Yet Poirot noticed his responses were measured, almost rehearsed, and when he mentioned the cardinal, a fleeting shadow crossed his expression, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to a trained eye. Poirot leaned forward, almost conspiratorially, and placed the crimson mask on the table between them. "Monsignor Ricci kept many things hidden, did he not?" Luciani's fingers twitched. "Yes, he—"
"But that is common in our service."
Poirot's small grey cells were already at work. He moved the mask slightly, tapping it gently with a finger. Sometimes the objects a man touches carry stories. Sometimes the absence of touch is even more revealing. He let the statement linger, then asked softly, "Would you mind placing this mask where you believe Monsignor might have left it himself?" Luciani paled slightly, then reached out and picked up the mask, hesitating for a moment. He positioned it carefully on the corner of the desk, yet not in the same orientation Poirot had observed earlier. The subtle difference, the slight tilt away from the center, the careful avoidance of the lamp was almost imperceptible, yet to Poirot it spoke volumes. Poirot murmured. Interesting. He allowed the silence to stretch, then continued. And yet, I suspect that whoever arranged the office on the night of his death was not merely following habit. There was a message, yes, a warning perhaps, or a reminder. Luciani's throat tightened, and for the first time he looked directly at Poirot, his composure faltering. I do not understand, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot's eyes glimmered with subtle satisfaction. But you do, mon ami. You understand better than anyone, for you knew the past of Monseigneur Ricci, and you knew those who would fear its revelation. He leaned back, watching carefully as Luciani's hands fidgeted, betraying the careful mask of civility. Tell me, father, was the cardinal's visit as innocent as it seemed? Luciani's lips parted, and for a heartbeat he said nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, a shadow of recognition and fear crossed his features. A small, involuntary shiver ran through him, Poirot observed, noting the crack in the facade. The man who had seemed so composed in the prefecture, so confident of the authorities' solution, was suddenly revealing his unease. "Ah," Poirot said gently, "the human heart is a subtle instrument, Father Luciani. Even the most cautious will reveal a note when played correctly. One need only listen." The candlelight flickered across Luciani's face, highlighting the tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the hand brushing near the hidden pocket where the vial had been discovered. Poirot's intuition told him that this unconventional testing the mask, invoking memory, and observing the reaction had succeeded. A subtle truth had emerged. Someone who seemed peripheral had deeper knowledge, and his composure had been only a thin veneer. Poirot's small smile curved as he let the moment linger. The investigation had taken a decisive turn. A single, carefully orchestrated tactic had revealed the first real crack in the carefully constructed facade of deception. The criminal remained hidden, but now, thanks to the unorthodox method, the shadows had begun to reveal their outlines. The next morning, the Vatican corridors hummed with an unusual tension. Poirot arrived early, intending to review the Monsignor's office once more, retracing the path of observations that had revealed Luciani's subtle unease. Yet, as he entered, a flicker of unease crept over him. The wastebasket, where the broken envelope had lain, was empty. The lamp, once marked with faint wax smudges, gleamed spotless under the morning light. And the crimson mask, so central to the previous day's psychological test, was gone. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Ah, mon Dieu," he whispered, almost to himself. "Someone is clever indeed. Very clever, but not clever enough." He signaled to the Swiss guard to secure the room. Guards arrived, eyes wide with apprehension, and checked the corridors and nearby offices. Yet no one had entered, no one had been seen moving the objects. It was as though the evidence had vanished into thin air. The detective's mind raced, cataloguing possibilities. The removal was deliberate, timed precisely to delay scrutiny and mislead investigators. He turned to Father Luciani, who had been summoned again. The man's face betrayed immediate concern, the twitch in his left eye returning with sharper intensity. "Monsieur Poirot, I silence," Poirot said gently, holding up a hand. "We must observe carefully, yes? Tell me, have you noticed anyone acting unusually this morning?" Luciani shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "No, monsieur. But the mask, it is gone. The envelope. Everything has been removed." Poirot's gaze swept the office once more. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints beyond those already recorded. Someone had moved with knowledge, precision, and familiarity with the routines of the Vatican, perhaps even anticipating the detective's presence. He considered the implications. The evidence, the mask, the envelope, the lamp had been removed or altered to disrupt the momentum of the investigation. Whoever was behind this crime was watching, manipulating the timeline, and ready to protect their secret at any cost. "Very well," Poirot murmured. He crouched, examining the polished floor beneath the desk. There, nearly invisible, was a faint smudge, a trace of red, as if the mask had been dragged. Along the marble, leaving only the slightest mark of its path. He traced it with his eyes, noting it disappeared toward the door leading to the cardinal's private chambers. Poirot rose and turned to Luciani. "Do you understand now why the crime was so carefully constructed? The removal of evidence, the misleading alibis, The seemingly innocent objects, they are all part of a performance. The stage has been reset, my friend. But we still have footprints. Subtle, yes, yet sufficient. Luciani swallowed hard. But who would dare? The one who benefits, Father. The one who wishes the truth to remain buried, not for mere convenience, but for survival. Poirot's voice was soft, almost contemplative, and that is why vigilance must be constant. Trust is fragile, and in these corridors, loyalty and deception walk side by side. He moved to the window, peering across the courtyard, imagining the movements of those who watched from the shadows. The cardinal's private chambers were near, as were the offices of aides and secretaries. Any one of them could have had both motive and opportunity, and all were aware that the investigation had gained momentum. Removing or altering evidence was not just precaution but a warning. Poirot exhaled slowly, straightening. The game had shifted. What had seemed a straightforward thread of psychological observation now included a predator willing to strike preemptively, bending reality and erasing proof to maintain control. The stakes had risen. The criminal was closer than ever, and patience alone would not suffice. He placed a hand lightly on the desk, imagining the mask, the envelope, the faint wax, each item a voice now silenced. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured, "the truth does not vanish so easily. But one must act with subtlety, with foresight. Whoever removed these objects will soon reveal themselves, and when they do, the game will truly begin." Outside, the courtyard remained quiet, almost serene, yet Poirot sensed the tension hidden in the shadows. The vanishing evidence was a message calculated, daring, and meant to test the detective. And Poirot, small but undeterred, already planned his next move, knowing the criminal's patience would not last forever. The quiet of the Vatican corridors was shattered mid-afternoon by a sudden, panicked cry echoing from the Apostolic Library. Poirot, who had been reviewing his notes in the prefecture, felt a chill run through him. Without hesitation, he hurried toward the sound, his cane clicking sharply against the marble floors, each step measured, alert. The corridors were empty, yet the tension in the air was palpable, a tangible pulse of fear that seemed to radiate from every corner. When he arrived, the scene was chaos. Brother Matteo, pale and trembling, pointed toward a room where the doors had been flung open. The body of Signorina Livia Conti lay crumpled against a chair, unconscious but breathing. The chair had been overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and in the center of the mess lay a small vial shattered, its contents staining the carpet with a fine red powder. A faint, sweet scent of almonds lingered in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Poirot's sharp eyes absorbed every detail, the trajectory of the vial, the angle of the overturned chair, the position of the scattered papers. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured, his mind racing. "The game is escalating. The villain is no longer content to manipulate from the shadows now. He strikes directly." Father Luciani arrived moments later, his face pale, the tremor in his hands betraying more than fear for the secretary. "Monsieur Poirot, it is not yet dead, my friend, but close to danger," Poirot interrupted. "Observe carefully. The attack was deliberate, yet designed to frighten rather than destroy. A message, yes, or a warning." He examined the broken vial, noting the red residue and the faint almond scent. Poison subtle, calculated, intended to incapacitate. Poirot's small grey cells worked furiously. Whoever had removed the mask and the envelope the day before had now shifted their strategy. The attack was no longer indirect. It was a threat aimed at those who had grown too close to the truth. Poirot crouched beside the unconscious Signorina, noting the pattern of the scattered papers. Among them was a single document slightly folded, unlike the others, as if deliberately placed. He picked it up carefully, examining the writing. It was a ledger entry from years ago, mentioning Monsignor Rixi and a series of financial discrepancies that had long been buried. The significance was clear. The perpetrator wanted this document to be noticed, yet framed the scene to terrorize and distract. He rose, turning to Luciani. "Do you understand now? The criminal is not merely hiding. He is orchestrating, testing, and manipulating. The removal of evidence, the psychological misdirection, and now a direct attack, these are steps in a larger plan." Luciani swallowed hard, voice trembling. But who could do this? Poirot's eyes, small yet piercing, scanned the corridors, noting the angles of windows, access points, and staff movements. The hand that strikes in such a calculated manner must be familiar with the rhythms of the Vatican, someone who knows where evidence can be removed without notice and how to strike without being seen. And yet, the slightest trace remains the faint drag of the mask yesterday, the angle of the chair today. Observe the small things, Luciani, and one sees the pattern. He turned back to the unconscious Signorina, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We must act quickly. The villain is bold now, aware that the investigation accelerates. He may strike again, and we must anticipate him. This is no longer merely a matter of solving a past murder. It is preventing the next one. Outside, the evening sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the Gothic arches. Poirot, small and deliberate, surveyed the scene with unflinching focus. The game had shifted dramatically, and the stakes had never been higher. The villain remained several steps ahead, but Hercule Poirot, undeterred, was already calculating, observing, and preparing for the moment when the shadow would reveal itself. The next move, he knew, would be decisive, and he would be ready. The Vatican corridors had emptied once more, leaving only the faint echo of hurried footsteps and the distant toll of a bell. Poirot remained in the Monsignor's office, alone with his thoughts and the lingering scent of almonds, his small grey cells turning over every detail with meticulous care. The chaos of the previous attack had sharpened his focus rather than distracted him. In fact, he realized, it was often in the midst of confusion that patterns revealed themselves most clearly. He surveyed the room again. The mask had been removed yesterday. The envelope vanished. The vial shattered, but there were traces, subtle and almost imperceptible, that had been overlooked. He crouched, examining the faint smear along the polished marble where the mask had been dragged. The curve of the mark, the way it seemed to veer toward the cardinal's private chambers, now suggested more than simple misdirection. It was a deliberate path, almost a signature. His gaze swept over the desk, and then it caught on something small, easily missed, a tiny indentation in the wax of a now-empty seal, barely perceptible under the morning light. The impression matched a particular type of stamp used not in official correspondence but in personal letters that had long been thought mundane. A memory flickered in an offhand remark by Signorina Conti during yesterday's questioning. She had said, almost as a casual aside, that the Monsignor preferred the old seals, the ones that reminded him of simpler times. Poirot's moustache twitched. That casual comment, dismissed at the time, now illuminated the past days with clarity. The Monsignor's preference for the old seal had allowed the perpetrator to manipulate the envelope, replacing it with an identical one to stage misdirection, confident that no one would suspect the substitution. The red mask, the flowers, the lamp each had been placed with attention to the Monsignor's habits, as if the criminal were rehearsing a scene for a man who had long been predictable in his meticulousness. He stood, moving deliberately to the vase where the disturbed lily had stood. He noticed the slight asymmetry in the stems, subtle enough to escape notice but meaningful to one who observed carefully. The flower, too, was a deliberate cue, signaling a movement, a passage, a minor detail intended to draw attention or misdirect it. Each act that had seemed random now coalesced into a calculated pattern, a choreography of fear and distraction, designed to test the investigation at every step. Poirot's mind turned to the ledger that had been scattered in Conti's attack. A seemingly trivial entry, overlooked in the mass of financial documents, was in fact a pivotal detail that linked past grievances with present actions. The same sequence of names, Ricci, Luciani, Bianchi, had appeared repeatedly over decades. The perpetrator had carefully exploited these connections, creating opportunities to manipulate, frighten, and steer attention while remaining hidden. He moved to the window, gazing across the courtyard as the late afternoon light cast the walls in gold. Suddenly, the arrangement of all previous clues, the mask, the envelope, the wax, the flowers, even the faint drag marks, fell into place. Each had been intended to highlight a minor distraction, a thread of curiosity, while the real message was hidden in the pattern itself. The criminal was communicating through misdirection, guiding the observer's eyes while keeping their own identity concealed. Poirot smiled faintly, the hint of triumph glimmering in his eyes. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured softly. The key was here all along, in the smallest things, the habits, the gestures, the casual words. One must only observe patiently, attentively, and allow the pattern to reveal itself. Now, I see clearly who plays this game and how. The office felt suddenly alive, charged with anticipation. The chaos of attack and vanishing evidence had not been random, it had been a symphony of signals, each note precise. And now that the rhythm had emerged, Poirot understood the next steps. The villain's method, audacious yet deliberate, had been laid bare not through grand gestures, but through the subtle, ordinary details that no one had thought significant. Outside, shadows lengthened across the Vatican courtyard, yet within the office, a calm certainty had settled. The pattern had emerged. The next move was clear, and Hercule Poirot, armed with this insight, was poised to strike at the heart of the deception before the criminal could act again. Poirot spent the early evening retracing every detail, the quiet of the Vatican now a canvas upon which his mind could trace the lines of the puzzle. The pattern had emerged, each subtle clue the mask, the envelope, the flower, the wax placed not as random acts but as deliberate signposts pointing toward the perpetrator's mind. And now, the question that remained was why? What drove someone to weave such a meticulous web of manipulation, fear, and violence? He summoned Father Luciani once more, this time with a calm authority that brooked no pretense. Luciani entered hesitantly, his eyes darting toward the office door, as if expecting some new, unseen threat. Poirot gestured for him to sit, the detective's gaze steady, calculating, yet gentle. "Father, you have seen much in recent days. You have observed events, perhaps without realizing their significance. It is time, now, for the truth to speak." Luciani's hands clenched in his lap, and a subtle tremor betrayed his anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot—" Poirot interrupted softly. "Listen! The pattern we observed, every misdirection, every minor attack, every vanishing object was designed not merely to mislead, it was to send a message. The question, mon ami, is why? Why would someone go to such lengths?" Luciana's lips parted, then closed again, his composure fraying under the weight of Poirot's gaze. The detective leaned closer, small eyes glinting with insight. "The motive is not money, not ambition, not even revenge in the conventional sense. It is far subtler. Consider the past, the ledger, the financial discrepancies, the suppressed misdeeds from years ago. Consider the relationships Ricci, the cardinal, yourself. Someone felt wronged, yes, but not in the way we first imagined. The offense lies in the mind, in pride, in a sense of perceived betrayal long buried." Luciana's hand lifted, trembling, as if to defend, yet he could not. "You mean someone seeks justice of a kind personal?" Poirot nodded slowly, the faintest smile appearing at the corners of his lips. "Precisely. The villain is motivated by the need to assert intellectual and moral superiority, to teach a lesson. The crime, the misdirection, the terror of it is orchestrated to demonstrate control, to manipulate those who had been complacent in the past, to show them that every action, every oversight, leaves a trace, and that the consequences, though delayed, are inexorable." Luciana's breath caught, and he looked away, unable to meet Poirot's gaze. The revelation struck him as sharply as the truth would strike anyone whose own life had been entangled in decades-old secrets. But the poison, the mask, the attack on Signorina Conti, Poirot waved a hand, all part of the message. Not to destroy for its own sake, but to demonstrate that the mind behind this work is always present, always observing, always several steps ahead. Fear, misdirection, subtle violence, they are instruments of pedagogy in the criminal's mind. He rose, moving toward the window, gazing down at the courtyards bathed in fading sunlight. "The offender, my friend, is a master not of opportunity, but of psychology. They exploit human nature, the desire to hide faults, the tendency to trust appearances, the small vanities and fears that shape every action. Their motive is not material, it is an assertion of intellectual dominance, a demand that the past be acknowledged, the wrongs understood, and their control recognized." Luciana's shoulders slumped. "I never imagined—" Poirot turned, small grey cells whirring with precision. "Few would. That is why they are so dangerous. When a mind acts not from greed, but from the need to impose its own vision upon others, ordinary measures fail, and when the past is weaponized, one sees not merely a crime but a statement, a philosophy executed through terror and subtlety. He leaned forward slightly, eyes piercing. This is the villain's essence, Father. Understanding this is the key. We now see clearly why every minor act, every misdirection, every disappearance of evidence was necessary. The crime was never merely about Rix's death. It was about the assertion of a mind, the revelation of a pattern that others had ignored or dismissed, and it is that understanding which will allow us to anticipate the next move and, I hope, prevent further tragedy. Outside, the light faded completely, and the shadows of the Vatican deepened. Within the office, Poirot's mind worked steadily, dissecting the psychology of the criminal, tracing the intricate threads of pride, obsession, and retribution that had driven this elaborate scheme. The hidden motive was no longer a mystery. It was revealed, chilling in its clarity, and it would guide Poirot to the final confrontation yet to come. Poirot spent the night in quiet preparation, the dim candlelight of the prefecture casting elongated shadows across his papers. Every detail, the red mask, the wax, the faint drag marks, the ledger entries, the subtle psychological cues had been catalogued, sequenced, and tested in his mind. The villain had acted with audacity and patience, but Poirot knew now exactly how to draw him into the open. There would be no more misdirection. The game would end tonight. He summoned the remaining key figures under the guise of a routine discussion of the office attack. Father Luciani, Cardinal Bianchi, and Brother Matteo entered one by one, unaware that this meeting was, in reality, a trap. Poirot positioned himself at the center of the office, the crimson mask placed deliberately on the desk, a single envelope with the old wax seal returned to its original spot. Every object was a law, arranged to provoke recognition, to challenge the guilty conscience. "Mess Amis," Poirot began, his voice calm yet commanding. "Tonight, we gather not merely to recount events, but to observe, for often, the guilty cannot resist revealing themselves when confronted with what they believe is inconsequential." His eyes flicked subtly to each person, lingering longest on Luciani. The young brother Matteo fidgeted, glancing nervously at the mask. Cardinal Bianchi's hands remained folded, expression controlled, yet Poirot detected the slightest tightening of his jaw. Luciani, however, seemed to shrink beneath the gaze, a bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the cool evening air. Poirot continued, "Yesterday, certain objects were moved, evidence disappeared, a subtle warning delivered. It was an act both clever and audacious. But the traces remain, my friends, as fingerprints remain in the mind, even when absent from paper." He leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "The mask, the envelope, the wax, the flower, they were not random. Each was a signal, and the signals were received. Correctly interpreted, they reveal the truth." A sharp intake of breath came from Luciani. Poirot's eyes twinkled with satisfaction, but he remained composed, letting the silence build tension like a slowly drawn bow. "Now, tell me, Father," he said gently, "what compelled one to orchestrate such a performance? Was it fear, ambition, revenge, or something deeper?" Luciani's composure cracked, his body stiff, his voice barely above a whisper. I could not let them forget. The past, the humiliation, the oversight, the wrongs that were never acknowledged." His confession tumbled out in halting fragments, each word revealing the obsession that had driven him. "Monsignor Rixi, the ledger..." "The Cardinal. I had to show them." Poirot nodded, letting the confession settle into the room like a tangible weight. "Yes, Father, we understand now. Not mere greed or vengeance, but the need to assert one's intellect, one's moral perspective, to orchestrate events so that the lesson is unmistakable. And yet," he added, rising fully, "there is a final point to consider. One does not act with poison and misdirection without risk. The law and truth cannot be evaded forever." Luciani's hands shook as he glanced at the mask, at the envelope, at the careful arrangement of each clue. Panic edged into his confession. I only intended to frighten, not to harm. To make them see." Poirot's small eyes glimmered with quiet triumph. "Ah, yes. The brilliance and the folly are intertwined, but the consequence of your actions cannot be undone. You have revealed the motive, the pattern, and the methods. And now justice, which is patient, must complete its course. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the office, the only sound the faint rustle of papers. Luciani's shoulders sagged, his resistance dissolved. Then, in a final desperate gesture, he lunged toward the window, intending escape. Poirot reacted instantly, stepping aside with precision, guiding Luciani to the floor and securing him until the Swiss guard arrived moments later. The trap had worked flawlessly. The villain, cornered, revealed, and unable to resist the subtle pressures Poirot had carefully applied, was now in custody. Poirot straightened, eyes sweeping the office once more. The mask, the envelope, the wax, the flowers remained as they had been arranged, silent witnesses to a carefully orchestrated confrontation. "Ah, mon Dieu," he whispered softly, almost to himself. The truth, hidden for so long, emerges when patience, observation, and intellect meet cunning and audacity. Justice, like the finest symphony, requires that every note fall into place, and tonight it has. Outside, the shadows of the Vatican deepened under the moonlight, yet inside, order and clarity had returned. Hercule Poirot, small and composed, finally allowed himself a quiet smile. Knowing the game was concluded and the intricate web of deception had been unraveled, the office had settled into an uneasy quiet. Father Luciani, subdued and handcuffed, sat under the watchful gaze of the Swiss guard, and the rest of the prefecture's staff breathed a collective sigh of relief. Poirot stood by the desk, examining the carefully arranged objects one last time. The mask, the envelope, the wax, the flower, they now seemed almost ceremonial, tokens of a game that had been played and won. And yet a faint unease prickled at his mind, the smallest whisper that all was not yet as it seemed. He moved slowly toward the window, his eyes tracing the familiar courtyards bathed in moonlight. Something about the pattern, the meticulous way the mask had been dragged, the careful placement of the flower, even the sequence of Luciani's reactions, had been entirely consistent with his calculations. And yet, a single nagging inconsistency tugged at the edge of his consciousness. His gaze returned to the ledger scattered during the attack on Signorina Conti. The entry that had seemed decisive, a record linking Luciani to Rix's past grievances, suddenly appeared incomplete. There was a margin note, written in a hand that was not Luciani's, faint, precise, and almost invisible under the flickering candlelight. Poirot's mustache twitched. The note referenced an account that had never been questioned, an individual whose name had appeared repeatedly in subtle, overlooked ways. Brother Matteo. Poirot's mind raced. Matteo, the young assistant who had been so frightened, so careful, so seemingly peripheral. The boy who had delivered messages, managed documents, and observed events quietly, almost invisibly. Could he have been more than a passive observer? Could he have manipulated the scenes, guided Luciani's reactions, and orchestrated the subtle misdirection that had led to the first attack, the vanishing evidence, and even Luciani's eventual confession? He turned sharply, scanning the room for the boy, who stood frozen near the doorway. Poirot's voice was gentle, yet firm. "Brother Matteo, mon ami, there is something we must discuss." The young man's eyes widened, and for the first time, the mask of fear faltered, revealing a flicker of calculated tension. Poirot's gaze held him, unblinking, as he walked slowly around the desk. "You have observed much in these past days, perhaps too much. Tell me, did you understand what your role might become, or did the necessity of your guidance simply evolve?" A sharp intake of breath, almost imperceptible. Matteo's fingers tightened around a rolled-up sheet of parchment, hidden behind his back. The detective's intuition, honed over decades, recognized the subtle gestures. A final desperate concealment, not of innocence, but of intent. Poirot's voice softened, almost conversational. "Mon Dieu! The truth is rarely simple. It appears in layers. The guilty may confess, the complicit may falter, but sometimes the smallest figure, the quietest observer, is the one whose mind orchestrates the dance." Matteo's defenses broke. He dropped the parchment, and it unrolled across the floor, revealing carefully detailed plans. The sequence of each act, the calculated placement of the mask, the envelope, the wax, even the timing of Luciana's exposure and the attack on Signorina Conti. Each step had been anticipated, each reaction predicted. The boy, gentle and seemingly terrified, had been the true architect, manipulating Luciani and others to enact his vision of control, his unspoken assertion of intellect and superiority. Poirot bent to retrieve the parchment, eyes glittering with both satisfaction and awe.
"Ah, mon Dieu,"
murmured softly. So it is not merely the obvious hand that commits, but the mind that guides unseen.
You have orchestrated, hidden in plain sight, and tested us all. Brother Matteo's shoulders slumped, the final mask of fear replaced by resignation. The lesson of patience, observation, and human nature had been learned, and the detective, once again, had discerned the ultimate truth. The case, though seemingly concluded, had concealed one final twist. The mastermind was the one least suspected, the quiet shadow behind every move, whose intellect and cunning had challenged even Hercule Poirot's formidable genius. Outside, the Vatican courtyards were silent beneath the moonlight. Within the office, Poirot, small and composed, finally allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. The game had tested his skill to the very last moment, and once again, his brilliance had revealed the hidden mind behind the mask of innocence. The shadows had yielded their secret at last. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the Vatican prefecture, illuminating the office in a calm clarity that contrasted sharply with the turmoil of the past days. Father Luciani sat quietly under the guard's watchful eyes, subdued but unharmed, while Brother Matteo, still pale but composed, had been quietly escorted to a nearby chamber for questioning. Poirot, small and deliberate, walked among the evidence one final time, eyes lingering on the mask, the wax, the envelope, and the scattered papers. Each had played its role in the intricate choreography of deception, yet each now stood as a testament to the detective's painstaking attention. He gathered the assembled staff and key figures in the office once more, his tone calm, almost conversational, yet carrying the weight of revelation. Mes amis, we have learned much. The pattern of misdirection, the subtle psychological pressures, even the attacks themselves, all were designed with great cleverness. But let us consider how the truth unfolded. He gestured toward the floor, where the final parchment still lay. Here, the orchestration is revealed. The meticulous planning, the manipulation of Mr. Luciani, the careful timing of the incidents, each a stroke in a larger design. Eyes turned toward Brother Matteo, who now met Poirot's gaze with a quiet acknowledgement, the mask of fear fully replaced by resignation. Poirot continued, it was not Luciani who commanded these events, though he played his unwitting role. It was the boy, observant, patient, intelligent beyond expectation. He understood human nature, how fear, pride, and the desire for secrecy could be guided like pieces on a chessboard. The mask, the envelope, the wax, the flower stools of distraction, of persuasion, of revelation, all served to direct attention while concealing the mind behind them. He paused, letting the words settle, watching the subtle reactions, the slight tension in the cardinal's hands, Luciani's stillness, and Matteo's faint acknowledgement. Notice, Poirot said, pointing gently toward the faint drag marks across the marble. The smallest details betray the greatest truths. Yesterday, these marks led to Luciani. Today, they, along with an offhand comment and a hidden ledger entry, exposed the real mastermind. Attention to the subtle, the overlooked, the seemingly innocuous. These are the tools of detection. Yet as Poirot spoke, a realization crept over him. Matteo, though exposed and cornered, had remained calm throughout, his intellect unbowed. The boy's planning had included contingencies, secret escapes, and means of eluding capture should the pattern be seen too soon. Poirot recognized the unsettling possibility that justice, though momentarily secured, was not guaranteed. The mind behind the orchestration was formidable, patient, clever, and ruthless in its calculation. He turned to the assembled figures, small eyes glinting with that familiar precision. We have captured what we can today, yet let us not fool ourselves. The mind that guided these events is still dangerous, and though we have unraveled the pattern, one must remain vigilant. The lessons hidden in these subtle clues, offhand comments, misplaced objects remind us that a criminal's ingenuity often exceeds expectation. Justice, in this case, may have been delivered in part, yet the shadow it casts endures. Poirot straightened, surveying the office one last time. Observe carefully, my friends. The mask, The envelope, the wax, the flower, the ledger, they all told a story. And it was through careful observation, patience, and understanding of human nature that the truth was revealed. The game has ended, yet one must always remember, the cleverest minds leave traces, even when they seem to vanish. Outside, the courtyard lay tranquil beneath the rising sun, yet inside, a subtle tension remained. Justice had been served, but only partially. Brother Matteo, though caught, had shown the brilliance and foresight that suggested he might yet evade full consequence, leaving an unsettling sense that the story was not entirely complete. Poirot, small, composed, and always several steps ahead, allowed himself a quiet, knowing smile. The truth had been uncovered, the pattern revealed, and the minds behind the deception exposed, but in the quiet shadows of the Vatican, the possibility of another move lingered, and the game, in a way, was not yet finished. The Vatican courtyard was quiet as Poirot stepped out into the early morning air, the first rays of sun glinting off the ancient stones. The city itself seemed oblivious to the tension that had gripped its most sacred halls over the past days, a timeless serenity masking the drama that had unfolded within. Poirot walked slowly, deliberately, letting the echoes of his cane strike the marble in rhythm with his thoughts. The case, as far as the world could see, had concluded. Justice, or at least its semblance, had been served. And yet, as he glanced back at the prefecture, a subtle unease tugged at his mind. The pattern had been revealed, the villain exposed, and yet one small detail continued to nag at him. The ledger, the margin note, the faint smudge of wax that had first suggested the manipulation of the envelope. He had traced the trail to Brother Matteo, uncovered the psychological orchestration, and witnessed the confession of Luciani. But something about the sequence of events had never felt entirely complete. The smallest things often carried the greatest secrets, and Poirot knew that in a mind as meticulous as Matteo's, there might be additional layers, subtler signals, or contingencies that even the most careful observation could miss. He paused beneath an archway, letting the cool air wash over him, and considered the cryptic nature of the messages left behind the mask, the envelope, the flowers, even the delicate tilt of the lamp. Each had been a calculated stroke, a challenge to the investigator's perception. And now that the final act of the drama had played out, Poirot realized that the story might not yet be finished. There were questions still unanswered. The offhand remark Signorina Conti had made in passing, the faint residue in the cardinal's study that had initially seemed irrelevant, the unusual pattern in Matteo's handwriting that had been dismissed as youthful carelessness. Each detail hinted at a hidden layer, a subtlety that might yet reveal itself in time. As he walked through the quiet courtyard, Poirot's sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement at the far edge of the shadowed colonnade. A piece of parchment, partially rolled and tucked into a crevice between the stones, glinted in the sunlight. He picked it up carefully, and a small smile curved his lips. The note was cryptic, containing only a few words. Observe always, for the smallest thread leads to the greatest unraveling. It was unsigned, yet its meaning was clear to him. The game, the lesson, the test, was ongoing. Someone was watching, someone who understood that detection was never final, that human nature always leaves traces. Poirot folded the note carefully, tucking it into his coat. His mind turned over the events, the psychology, the meticulously hidden patterns, and the layers of deception. The thrill of the investigation, the subtle challenge of untangling human motives, and the satisfaction of uncovering truth were all mingled with the recognition that even the most brilliant solution might leave a shadow unresolved. He adjusted his coat and continued down the stone pathway, each step measured, his thoughts quietly probing the remaining anomalies. The city of Rome, eternal and indifferent, spread out before him. The morning bells tolled softly in the distance, marking the passage of time, yet within the detective's mind, the case remained alive, its smallest thread still waiting to be fully understood. Poirot allowed himself a faint, satisfied sigh. The villain had been revealed, justice had been addressed, and the pattern uncovered, but the world, he knew, was never entirely solved. There would always be another mystery, another subtle deception, another mind hidden behind the facade of innocence. The truth was never absolute, only revealed in glimpses, and Poirot, small, composed, and ever observant, would always be ready to see it. With a final glance at the Vatican's towering arches, Poirot stepped into the bustling streets. the note tucked safely in his coat, a silent reminder that even in resolution, questions remained. The case had ended, yet the mystery, like the city itself, was eternal. And in that quiet certainty, Poirot felt the familiar thrill of anticipation for the next challenge, the next subtle deception waiting just beyond the shadows.